This happened about 5 or 6 months after I moved into my new house, back when I was 24 with a decent job and just enough confidence to believe I had everything under control. The house itself was ordinary in most ways, but the basement was different. It was unusually spacious, stretching wider than the footprint of the house seemed to allow, and I mostly used it for storage because there was more room down there than I realistically needed. The previous owner had divided the space into separate sections using plywood sheets and exposed wooden framing, creating rough, unfinished rooms that didn't quite feel like rooms at all. At the bottom of the stairs, there was a main open area that everything fed into, and off to one side sat a laundry section that was meant to double as a workshop, though it looked like whatever project had started there had been abandoned halfway through. The partitions didn't reach all the way to the ceiling, leaving gaps where shadows pooled, and the layout formed narrow passageways and blind corners that made it impossible to see the entire basement from any one spot. At first it just seemed practical, maybe a little unfinished, but over time I began to notice how sound behaved strangely down there, how certain corners felt like colder than others, and how the space seemed larger at night than it ever did during the day. The first night I heard the knocking, it came from directly beneath my bed, 3 slow taps spaced so evenly it felt intentional, like someone measuring time with their knuckles, and I remember lying there, staring into the dark, thinking that houses don't make sounds like that unless someone is making them, and someone could not possibly be under my bed, because my bedroom was on the first floor and beneath it was the basement, sealed, unfinished, and supposedly empty, except for the old furnace and a stack of paint cans left by the previous owner. So I held my breath and waited for it to happen again, and when it did, 3 more taps, same rhythm, same careful spacing, I felt something colder than fear settle into me. The understanding that whatever was making that sound knew exactly where I was. I had moved into the house 2 weeks earlier, after my aunt passed it down to me, and everyone in the family described it the same way. Solid, quiet, a little outdated, but dependable. The kind of place that holds its shape through storms. But no one had mentioned the basement except to say the stairs were steep and the light down there flickered, and the first time I'd opened the basement door, I'd felt this draft rise up the steps that smelled faintly metallic and old, like coins left in water, and I'd shut it again without really knowing why. The knocking came again the next night, not under the bed this time, but from the direction of the closet. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, and I told myself it was pipes adjusting to temperature changes, that old houses shift and breathe, but the rhythm never changed, and that was what made it worse, because random sounds are chaotic and forgettable, but patterns feel deliberate. By the 3rd night, I decided I needed to prove to myself it was nothing. So I waited for the taps, and when they started, I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the floor, and I could feel the faint vibration of each knock travel through the wood into my skin. And I realized it wasn't coming from everywhere. It was coming from one specific point directly beneath the center of the room. And that point aligned exactly with the unfinished section of the basement floor, where the concrete looked slightly darker than the rest, a patch I'd noticed but ignored. I didn't sleep that night, and around 3:12 a.m., the knocking stopped and was replaced by something softer, like the sound of fingernails brushing lightly across a surface. Not scratching, just tracing. Slow and patient. The next morning I went down into the basement for the first time since moving in, forcing myself to keep the light on despite its faint stuttering flicker, and the air felt thicker than it should have, like it had weight. And when I stepped onto the concrete, I felt a strange reluctance, like my body didn't want to cross into the center of the room, but I did, and I stood over the darker patch and crouched down and ran my hand across it. And it felt no different from the rest of the floor except slightly cooler. And when I knocked on it with my knuckles, it produced a duller sound than the surrounding concrete, as if something hollow lay beneath it. I told myself I was imagining things until that night, when the pattern changed. For the first time, instead of 3 taps, there were 4, slow and evenly spaced, and after a pause, 4 more. And I realized, with a tightening in my chest, that the pattern had shifted to match the number of steps it would take to walk from the basement stairs to the center of the room. The next evening I tested something I'm not sure I fully thought through. I went down to the basement at exactly 3 a.m., turned off the light, and stood in the darkness above the darker patch of floor, and I knocked 3 times on the concrete with my knuckles and waited. And for a moment, there was nothing, just the hum of the furnace and my own breathing. And then from beneath the floor, directly below my hands, came 3 knocks in response, perfectly spaced, perfectly matched, and so precise that any hope of coincidence drained out of me like air from a punctured lung. I didn't run, which I still don't understand. I just stood there listening, and after a few seconds, there was another sound, not knocking this time, but something shifting slowly, like fabric brushing against stone. I began to notice small changes in the house after that. Subtle things that would have been easy to dismiss if not for the timing. Doors left slightly ajar that I was certain I'd closed. The basement light already on when I knew I hadn't turned it on. The temperature in my bedroom dropping a few degrees colder than the rest of the house around the same time each night. Always just before the knocking started. A week later, I found something new in the basement. Something that hadn't been there before, a thin line drawn in what looked like chalk across the darker patch of concrete, perfectly straight, dividing it into 2 equal halves. And I stood staring at it for a long time because I hadn't drawn it and no one else had access to the house. That night, the knocking didn't come from beneath my bed, it came from inside the walls, faint but unmistakable, moving slowly from one side of the room to the other, as if something was tracing the perimeter. I started keeping notes after that, documenting the time and pattern of each sound, and I realized the changes followed a progression. 3 knocks for the first few nights, then 4, then 5. Each increase happening after I acknowledged it in some way, like it was responding to my awareness. And when I stopped going into the basement for a few days, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it felt less like communication and more like impatience. I tried recording the sound with my phone one night, setting it on the floor before going to bed, but when I checked the audio in the morning, there was nothing except a faint, static hum. And yet I distinctly remembered waking at 2:47 a.m. to the steady tapping beneath me. The most unsettling part wasn't the noise itself, but the way it began to feel synchronized with me. If I shifted in bed, the tapping would pause. If I held my breath, it would stop completely, as if it were waiting to see what I would do next. One night, desperate for clarity, I spoke aloud into the darkness, asking who was there, and for several seconds there was silence so complete it made my ears ring. And then directly beneath my headboard came a single knock. Just one, firm and final, and I felt something like acknowledgement pass between the floor and me. After that, the rules seemed to solidify. The knocking only happened between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. It always matched the number of steps from the basement stairs to the center of the room, and it stopped immediately if I turned on all the lights in the house, but resumed the second I turned them off, and the chalk line in the basement grew darker each day as if retraced. The first time I saw movement, I convinced myself it was a trick of light. I was halfway down the basement stairs when I noticed a slight shift in the shadow over the darker patch of floor, not rising or falling, but bending slightly inward, like a reflection in warped glass. And when I blinked, it was normal again. I began sleeping with the basement door locked, though I had no memory of ever finding a key for it before. And sometimes in the mornings, I would find the lock turned the opposite direction from how I'd left it. Not broken, not forced, just reversed. The third week brought something new. The knocking stopped entirely, replaced by a faint humming that vibrated through the pipes and into the walls, low and steady like someone holding a single note. And I felt it more than heard it, a resonance that made my teeth ache. I told myself I would leave the house if anything else changed. And that very night I woke to find my bedroom door open and the hallway light on, casting a thin line across the floorboards. And at the edge of that light, just before it faded into darkness, I saw a shadow that didn't belong to anything in the room. Tall and narrow, stretching upward as if cast by something, standing just outside my view. I didn't move, I didn't breathe, and after a long moment the shadow shifted slightly to the left, then vanished as the hallway light flicked off. The next morning the basement door stood open, the chalk line now forming a complete rectangle around the darker patch of floor. And in the center of it, someone had written a single word in careful, deliberate letters. Closer. I wish I could say I left then, but curiosity has a way of disguising itself as bravery, and I felt compelled to understand what closer meant. So that night at 3 a.m., I stood once again over the darker patch and knocked 5 times, matching the pattern I'd heard the night before. And after a pause came 5 knocks in return, followed by a 6th, and I felt the air shift around me as if something beneath the concrete had adjusted its position. The humming grew louder over the next few days, no longer confined to the basement but drifting into the vents and under the doors. And I started noticing small indentations in the dust along the basement floor, impressions that looked almost like footprints, but not quite shaped like any shoe I recognized, leading from the darker patch toward the base of the stairs, and stopping just short of the first step. I began to sense that whatever was beneath the floor wasn't trying to get out so much as trying to measure the distance between us, counting steps, marking boundaries, redrawing lines. The final change came quietly, without knocking or humming. I woke one night to complete silence, the kind that feels staged, and when I looked at the clock, it read 3:12 a.m., the usual time, but there was no sound from below, no vibration, and for the first time since moving in, I felt an absence instead of a presence, which was somehow worse. I lay there for several minutes before realizing that the silence wasn't empty, it was waiting. And then from directly beside my bed, not beneath it but level with me, came 3 slow taps against the wall, perfectly spaced, perfectly measured. And I understood then that the distance had closed, that whatever had been beneath the basement floor had finished counting the steps and no longer needed them. I haven't gone back into the basement since that night, though sometimes I find faint chalk dust at the edge of my bedroom doorway, and every so often, just before sleep takes me, I feel a subtle vibration in the wall beside my head. Not loud enough to call knocking, just enough to remind me that patterns don't disappear, they just move closer, and I've started leaving a small gap between my bed and the wall because I've learned that when the tapping starts, it's better not to be directly against it. And last night, for the first time, I heard it from the ceiling instead of the wall. 3 slow taps, spaced so evenly it felt intentional. And I lay there staring into the dark, thinking that houses don't make sounds like that unless someone is making them. And someone could not possibly be above me, because there is nothing above my bedroom except the attic, sealed, unfinished, and supposedly empty.